Robert Carradine is the Hollywood veteran who offed himself on February 23, 2026, ending a 20-year internal war that the public never saw coming. This man defined a generation of outsiders as Lewis Skolnick and anchored a Disney dynasty as Sam Maguire before vanishing into the Los Angeles quiet at age 71. Why did an actor on the verge of a professional comeback suddenly go radio silent? And what really happened during that horrific 2015 collision in Colorado? Connie Lamorth originally envisioned the film The Driver as a gritty reinvention for its lead actor, casting Robert Carradine against type as a hardened crime boss named Antonio Politano. Production moved back onto the active schedule in January of 2026, following years of pandemic delays, and early reports from the set suggested that Carradine felt energized by the challenge of such a heavy role. That professional momentum hit a wall of absolute silence in mid-February, which is when the veteran performer failed to appear for a mandatory table read. This missed meeting sent ripples through the production team because Carradine had been a steady presence in the industry since his 1971 debut on the series Bonanza. Lamorth attempted to reach him repeatedly, but her messages were left on read, and the actor became what she described as radio silent. The result was a desperate call to a family contact who revealed that Robert was currently struggling with his mental health, which meant the production team decided to give him space to recover. They expected him to return once the pressure of the lead role subsided, but the silence only ended when his brother Keith officially confirmed his passing on February 23. That empty chair at the table read turned out to be the final symptom of a total psychological blackout rather than a simple case of stage fright or scheduling friction. None of that mattered once the news broke, as the industry realized that the bedrock of the Carradine family had finally reached a breaking point that had been building for decades. The quiet on that film set was just the beginning of a much larger revelation, and this is where it gets worse, because the family was about to reveal just how long Robert had been navigating the shadows. Keith Carradine released a statement that functioned as a clinical map of a 20-year siege, explaining that his brother had been fighting a valiant struggle against bipolar disorder since approximately 2006. This condition forces a person through a cycle of neurological whiplash, swinging them between manic peaks of high energy and the crushing gravity of deep depression. Robert was navigating this internal minefield while simultaneously playing the supportive father Sam Maguire on the Disney Channel, which meant he was a beacon of light for millions of children while his own interior world was dimming. The problem was that the family had to maintain a brave face for the industry, even as Robert's illness grew increasingly unpredictable over 2 decades. Keith insisted there was no shame in the diagnosis and described it as a sickness that simply got the best of him after years of high-functioning effort. By tracing the onset back to 2006, the survivors highlighted a profound duality where the man known for his comedic timing and warmth was actually surviving a private war that rarely made it into the tabloids. His manic cycles likely fueled the creative fire needed to launch the King of the Nerds reality franchise, but the depressive phases remained a hidden threat that eventually eroded his foundations. The family admitted that Robert was a profoundly gifted soul who took solace in humor, and they hoped his journey would finally shine a light on the stigma that often attaches to these terminal outcomes. This internal conflict reached a public flashpoint in the mountains of Colorado, where the private war briefly became a matter of police record. The shadows were deep, but a high-speed impact on a fair-weather afternoon provided the first real evidence that Robert's struggle had turned physically dangerous. March 5, 2015, saw Robert Carradine behind the wheel of a 2003 Mercury Marauder on Highway 145 near the small town of Dolores, Colorado. Fair weather and clear roads offered no explanation for why the vehicle suddenly drifted across the center line and struck an oncoming tractor-trailer head-on. Firefighters had to extricate Robert and his wife Edith from the mangled steel, and photos of the wreck showed a car that had been completely shredded by the force of the semi-truck. Neither speed nor alcohol were factors in the crash, according to Sergeant James Saunders, and the result was a simple citation for careless driving that Carradine settled with a check for $169.50. This mundane legal resolution masked a much darker reality that only surfaced in 2017 during a highly publicized and ugly divorce proceeding. Edith Manny filed court documents alleging the crash was a planned dual terminal event, claiming that Robert admitted to her and their 2 children that he deliberately drove into the truck to end their lives. Carradine admitted to being in a psychotic state during the 2015 collision, though he blamed the crisis on his wife for allegedly cutting off his bipolar medication. The experienced race car driver had veered into the path of a Honda semi-truck while suffering from severe depression, and what nobody expected was that this near-fatal event was a direct rehearsal for the silence of 2026. This wasn't just a lapse in focus on a mountain road. It was the physical manifestation of a psychological break that had been triggered years earlier in Southeast Asia. The collision in Colorado revealed a man who had reached his limit, but the original infection had started with a phone call from a hotel room in Thailand. June 4, 2009 remains the date that changed the Carradine family forever, when David Keredine was found dead in a closet at the Swissotel Nilert Park in Bangkok. The star of Kung Fu and Kill Bill was found naked with a cord wrapped around his neck and genitals, leading to a media circus that obsessed over the kinky details of his passing. While 2 autopsies eventually ruled the cause as accidental asphyxiation linked to a lone sex practice, the damage to Robert's mental health was already done. Leaked forensic images of the death scene appeared in a Thai newspaper, which devastated the family and acted as the specific trigger for Robert's first major decline. Keith Carradine later observed that this 2009 tragedy was the catalyst that shattered Robert's reality and led to his official bipolar diagnosis. The 2 brothers had been inseparable icons who shared the screen in films like The Long Riders, and seeing his mentor reduced to a tabloid headline was more than Robert's mind could absorb. The result was an inherited void that Robert tried to fill with professional work and a brave face, even as he privately struggled with the uncertainty surrounding his brother's end. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Barden noted that he couldn't entirely rule out homicide, and that lingering doubt added a layer of chronic stress to an already fragile psychological state. This trauma didn't just cause grief, it accelerated a neurological shift that eventually made the nerd icon a prisoner of his own extreme mood swings. The ghost of that hotel room in Thailand followed Robert back to Los Angeles, adding a crushing weight to an already heavy family legacy. John Carradine cast a massive architectural shadow over his sons, having appeared in over 350 films as one of Hollywood's most prolific character actors. This lineage meant that Robert, Keith, and David were born into a specialized class of performers where talent was expected, and public tragedy was the recurring price of the name. Robert often functioned as the connective tissue of this dynasty, and Keith described his younger brother as the bedrock of the family who offered wisdom and tolerance to everyone around him. Problem was that being the anchor for a house of titans meant Robert had to absorb the shockwaves of every familial loss and public scandal. Eva Carradine followed her father into the profession and achieved her own success, yet she grew up watching him navigate a reality that was becoming increasingly fragmented by his internal war. The Carradine name carried the prestige of Hollywood royalty, but it also functioned as a high-pressure chamber where the air was thin and the expectations were absolute. Repaying the debt of his famous bloodline often came at the expense of Robert's own peace, and he spent 50 years trying to keep the family upright while his own foundations eroded. He was the wise and accepting patriarch at home, yet he was also fighting to protect a different identity that had made him a hero to a generation of outsiders. That changed when the burden of being the family anchor finally collided with the exhaustion of maintaining his most famous public persona. The legacy was a gift that felt like a burden, and the man behind the glasses was tired of playing the part of the resilient underdog. 1984 was the year Robert Carradine unleashed a nasally laugh that redefined the comedy landscape in Revenge of the Nerds. His portrayal of Lewis Skolnick birthed a cultural archetype for the resilient underdog, but the laughter of the character was often a defensive wall for the man behind the pocket protector. The 20-year struggle mentioned by his family suggests that Robert was navigating his most violent internal cycles while the public was celebrating his nerd revival. Curtis Armstrong, his longtime co-star, admitted that the King of the Nerds reality show was born out of a practical need to pay for their children's expensive college tuitions. Robert was the architect of that show and insisted on a format built on equality and tolerance to avoid the backbiting and cruelty typical of the genre. The result was a profound paradox where he was producing a show about nerds being in it together while he was drifting into a state of total psychological solitude. Maintaining the persona of a beacon of light required an immense amount of energy, and the high-energy mania of his condition was often mistaken for creative passion by his colleagues. The very traits that made him a beloved performer were actually symptoms of the illness that would eventually get the best of him in 2026. He spent decades perfecting the art of the brave face, teaching the world that it was okay to be an outsider while he felt like a stranger in his own mind. As his television roles began to diminish, he turned to the digital world to stay connected, creating a record of his final thoughts through a podcast. July 2025 marked the launch of the Party Nerds podcast, a digital victory lap where Robert Carradine interviewed peers like Christopher Atkins and Jesse Hutch. He seemed to be finding his footing in this new medium, and his final recordings from February of 2026 offered no hint of the terminal act that was only weeks away. A casual observer would have seen a man who was active and engaged, and the signal he sent to the world was one of creative resurgence and professional momentum. February 3, 2026 provided the last visual record of Robert when he posted a photo to Instagram alongside his guest, Don Wilson. He sat in a recording studio wearing a casual olive shirt and dark blue jeans, and he flashed a genuine smile that seemed to reach his eyes. The caption mentioned cool stories and upcoming episodes, but this was the brave face his brother later described as a final performance for the public. Between that smiling post on the 3rd and the missed table read in mid-February, the digital signal simply flatlined without warning. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was being abandoned as the actor moved into a state of total radio silence. This final digital footprint serves as a haunting reminder of the Magaya patriarch's duality as he projected warmth into a microphone while his internal world prepared for the final blackout. The digital signal died, but a new message was about to emerge from the family that sought to turn this tragedy into a mission of truth. February 23, 2026 saw the Carradine family bypass the usual vague PR statements to release a coordinated and honest indictment of the disease that took Robert's life. Keith Carradine spoke directly to outlets like Deadline and TMZ, explicitly naming bipolar disorder as the biological enemy that had fought his brother for 20 years. He stated that there was no shame in the struggle and wanted to celebrate Robert for his valiant fight against an illness that simply got the best of him. Hilary Duff took to Instagram to share her grief, admitting that the reality of losing an old friend was hard to face. She had grown up with the Magaya family warmth and felt deeply cared for by her on-screen parents, which made the news of Robert's private suffering even more painful to process. Jamie Lee Curtis also shared a lengthy tribute, describing their early relationship as her first experience with partnership and domesticity before Melanie Griffith called her to break the news of his passing. The survivors made a strategic choice to weaponize transparency in hopes of breaking the cyclical nature of the family's tragic history. They reframed the terminal event as a medical failure rather than a mysterious curse, seeking to use Robert's journey to encourage others to address the stigma of mental illness. Even with this honesty, the map of Robert's life remains a complex intersection of immense talent and the heavy price of an inherited bloodline. The long and winding road has reached its conclusion, and the bedrock of the dynasty has finally found a place to rest. Robert Carradine's story isn't just a record of a terminal choice made on a quiet Monday. It is a case study in the psychological tax paid by Hollywood royalty. He spent over 50 years as the stable center of a chaotic acting dynasty, and the foundation of wisdom he provided for others was being eroded by a 20-year storm nobody saw. The family has now reframed his tragic exit as the end of a valiant clinical war, choosing data and diagnosis over the sensationalism that once followed his brother David. He taught a generation that being an outsider was a badge of honor, yet he spent his own life trying to appear normal within a lineage defined by brilliance and pain. We are left with the image of a man smiling in a studio just weeks before the end, a final performance of a brave face that was likely his most exhausting role. If the man who anchored a dynasty can be pulled into the void by the weight of his own silence, it forces us to look at the fragility of every beacon we rely on. In a family of legends, even the bedrock can only hold so much weight before it finally gives way to the quiet.